Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, I always love getting requests from listeners for deep dives, and this one is no exception. Someone out there, you know who you are, asked about European defense spending and how it's changing after that whole Ukraine situation, which I have to say is a very timely request given this document we have right here, hot off the presses from the March 2025 European Council meeting. Basically, their game plan for, well, boosting Europe's defenses going forward. And I know you're particularly interested in the whole geopolitics meets economics angle, so this should be right up your alley.
Absolutely, and it's a fascinating document, a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, for sure. So, kind of our mission for this deep dive is to sort through it all, figure out what the EU's priorities are, how they're planning to, actually achieve all this, and ultimately what it all means for the future of Europe's security. The big picture stuff.
The big picture stuff, exactly. And one thing that jumps out right away, just from reading the opening statement, is the sense of urgency. I mean, they straight up call Russia's aggression an existential challenge, which is
Oh, yeah, that's pretty strong language.
strong indeed. And it's a definite shift from, let's say, the more cautious tone we saw in that 2022 Versailles Declaration.
Right. So, what do you think is driving that change in perspective? Is it just about Ukraine, or is there something deeper going on here?
Well, Ukraine is definitely the catalyst, right? I mean, it's been a wake-up call for Europe in a lot of ways. They're seeing firsthand the devastating consequences of, a large-scale conflict. And it's right on their doorstep.
It's hard to ignore that for sure.
Hard to ignore indeed. So it's not just about, oh, let's throw more money at defense and hope for the best. There's this real emphasis on becoming, as they put it, more sovereign, reducing strategic dependencies.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in practical terms? Like, give me an example.
Sure. Think about how reliant a lot of European countries were on Russian energy. That was a huge vulnerability, as we've all seen.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So this is about diversifying their energy sources, strengthening their own defense industries, basically reducing their reliance on external actors for, all those critical things.
Supplies, technology.
Exactly. Becoming more self-sufficient, or at least as self-sufficient as you can be in a globalized world.
Right, right. Which makes sense in theory, but I mean, this has got to be a massive undertaking. How are they actually planning to finance all of this? Because it can't be cheap.
Well, they've laid out a pretty diverse, I'd say, array of funding sources, increasing national defense budgets, of course, tapping into existing EU funding programs. They're even creating a new loan instrument, getting the European Investment Bank involved.
Oh, well, hold on. A new loan instrument.
Yep. And they're even talking about attracting private investment. It's a pretty ambitious plan, to say the least.
Yeah.
A lot of moving parts.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts is right. But there was this one thing that kind of caught my eye. This whole national escape clause thing under, what was it called? The Stability and Growth Pact.
Right, the Stability and Growth Pact. Essentially, it allows countries to temporarily exceed their usual budget limits if it's for defense spending, even if it impacts the EU's overall financial stability. It's a sign of how seriously they're taking the situation. But it also
Raises some eyebrows.
it raises some eyebrows, yeah. Could lead to some economic concerns down the line.
So basically, forget the budget, we need to arm ourselves. That's the message I'm getting.
Pretty much. And speaking of arming themselves, they have this whole list of priority areas for investment, right?
Yeah.
Which is,
Oh yeah, it's pretty revealing, that list. Air and missile defense, artillery systems, drones, and, get this, counter-drone tech, cyber defense, artificial intelligence, electronic warfare. It goes on.
they call it their first list of key capabilities to develop.
Okay, so what does this first list tell us about, their strategic thinking? The threats they're most worried about?
Well, it's a clear reflection of the lessons they're taking from Ukraine, right? The emphasis on air and missile defense, for example, shows they're really aware of how vulnerable cities and infrastructure are to long-range attacks.
Makes sense.
And then, the focus on artillery systems, particularly those with deep precision strike capabilities.
So they're really analyzing the current conflict and saying, okay, we need to be ready for this kind of fight.
Precisely. The whole list is tailored to, the evolving nature of modern warfare.
Very interesting. Now, this is where things get even more interesting, I think. The document stresses defending all EU land, air, and maritime borders, of course. But then it specifically calls out the EU's eastern border, for extra emphasis. Why do you think they did that?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? It highlights the, I'd say, varying levels of concern within the EU. The countries bordering Russia and Belarus, they obviously feel the threat most acutely. So they're, pushing for a more robust defense posture on that front.
Right.
But the document also emphasizes that, the security of one member state is the security of all. So it's like, yeah, the eastern border might be the immediate flashpoint, but the whole bloc needs to be prepared.
It's a balancing act then, addressing those specific anxieties of the frontline states, but also making sure everyone is on board, ready for potential threats.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but here's the thing. With all these funding sources they're talking about, this massive shopping list of military equipment and all that, how can they even be sure they're spending this money effectively? I mean, what are the biggest challenges they face in, like, actually getting results with all this?
That's a really, really crucial question. And it's interesting because the document actually goes beyond just, spending more money.
Mhm.
They're placing a lot of emphasis on things like joint procurement of military equipment, harmonized requirements, streamlining processes, that kind of thing.
But hasn't that historically been a bit of a struggle for the EU? I mean, you've got 27 member states, each with their own priorities, and, a lot of bureaucracy to wade through.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge challenge. And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. Can they actually overcome those historical difficulties in coordinating defense efforts? If they do pull it off.
Imagine the possibility.
Imagine
Yeah.
economies of scale, increased interoperability between their forces, a boost to European defense industries,
Hmm.
but achieving this level of cooperation, that's going to be the real test. It really is. It's a huge test of their commitment to this more integrated European defense structure.
Yeah.
And it's not just about internal coordination.
Hmm.
There's the elephant in the room. How does this all play with NATO? Especially given I know you're interested in the future of that alliance.
Oh, yeah, big time. I mean, is the EU basically trying to create their own, like, mini NATO here?
They're really careful to say, that their efforts are complementary to NATO, not competing. They still very much see NATO as the cornerstone of European defense, especially for those countries who are members of both.
I knew there was a but coming.
Well, in practice, I think some tension is almost inevitable.
Right.
If the EU really gets serious about boosting their own capabilities, will that mean they depend less on NATO? Could we even see some, duplication of effort? Or countries having to choose where to, put their resources?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's one thing to say you're not competing, but actually making that work in the real world, that's a whole different thing.
Absolutely. And this kind of ties into a much bigger question, I think. What role does the EU ultimately want to play, on the global stage?
That is a good question. Because they've always been kind of criticized for being a soft power giant, but a military dwarf. Is this a sign that they're finally ready to, flex some muscle?
It certainly seems that way. These conclusions really suggest, to me at least, a desire to be more assertive, to be able to act on their own and, decisively when they need to, which in today's world, with everything going on,
It's more important than ever, right?
it's crucial.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is a real turning point.
Absolutely. The old assumptions about European security, they're kind of gone now, aren't they? And the EU's definitely responding with a new sense of regency. So for someone like you, I mean, who's so plugged into all this, economics, geopolitics, the whole nine yards, what are the key things we should all be watching for here as this whole thing plays out? What's going to tell us if they're serious or if this is just a bunch of hot air?
Oh, that's a great question. So first, I'd say keep an eye on whether these big plans translate into actual action. Does the funding really materialize? Do member states actually, overcome their reluctance to work together on defense? Because we've seen that before.
A lot of talk, not a lot of action.
Yeah, exactly. So substance over style. The second thing I'd watch is how that EU-NATO relationship evolves. Will they really find a way to, complement each other? Or will those tensions, the ones we talked about, start creating some serious problems down the line?
Yeah, because those potential friction points, they're right there in the document, even if they don't want to admit it.
Exactly. And then finally, you have to think about the bigger picture, the geopolitical implications of, a more assertive EU. If they really do manage to boost their defense capabilities and act more independently, that's going to impact the global balance of power. Does it lead to more stability, or does it actually create new, rivalries and competition?
Okay, so those are some pretty big questions. I have to say, this deep dive is really making me think, but hang on, we're not quite done yet, are we? They mentioned an upcoming white paper on the future of European defense. That sounds like it could be pretty important.
Oh, it definitely will be. That white paper is going to be key, because it could give us a much, much clearer picture of where they see themselves heading in the long term.
Okay, so just to recap for a second. We've covered the whole existential challenge thing, the push for sovereignty, the funding puzzle, their shopping list of priorities, that whole border emphasis, and even the kind of awkward dance with NATO. I mean, it really does feel like a turning point for European defense. But what does it actually mean in the end? Like, if you had to look into your crystal ball, what might the European security landscape look like in, let's say, 5, 10 years?
That's a million-euro question, isn't it?
Hmm.
Impossible to say for sure, of course. But if I had to guess,
Give me your best guess. I love a good educated guess.
I think we're going to see a, more integrated and capable European defense structure. It might not be like a military superpower overnight, but they're taking real steps to become a more serious player in the security arena.
So like a gradual but noticeable shift toward a more, well, assertive EU on the world stage.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
But the exact trajectory, that depends on so many things. What happens in Ukraine, how much the member states actually want this, that whole transatlantic relationship.
Yeah.
And of course, all those unpredictable global events that, well, always seem to happen.
Right, the wild cards. Never a dull moment, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of uncertainty, but definitely some big changes on the horizon. I think this has been incredibly insightful. And I know our listener, with their interest in economics and geopolitics, is probably finding this all very, very relevant. But before we completely wrap things up, I have one more question for you. We talked about how the EU wants to become, more sovereign when it comes to defense. But what does that even really mean in a globalized world like we live in? Can any nation, or even a bloc like the EU, really be self-sufficient when it comes to defense these days?
That's a really, really good question. And I think it gets to, the heart of this whole shift we're seeing in European defense thinking. Because it is a tricky balance. On one hand, they clearly want to rely on others less, especially after seeing how dependent they were on Russia for energy and how that played out.
Yeah, that was a big wake-up call.
Huge wake-up call. But at the same time, being completely self-sufficient, when it comes to defense, I mean, it's incredibly hard, maybe even impossible in today's world. You think about all the technology involved in modern militaries. It's so complex.
Right, just the technology alone.
Exactly. Weapon systems, the supply chains, the specialized expertise you need, it's all so interconnected.
So even with all this talk about sovereignty, they're still going to have to rely on partners, on allies to some extent.
Oh, I think that's inevitable.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to that whole question about, NATO. If the EU really does become this, more significant military power, what does that do to their relationship with NATO? Can they really complement each other? Or are we going to see, more competition, more tension? What does it mean for the U.S., who has always, been such a big player in European security?
Big questions, more assertive EU, the whole NATO dynamic changing,
Yeah.
all against the backdrop of, well, everything else happening in the world. A lot to think about.
It really is. And I think given your interest in, the intersection of economics and geopolitics, this is all going to be really fascinating to watch unfold. Because ultimately, this is all about resources, about influence, about how, power dynamics are shifting globally.
Very well said. I think this deep dive has given our listener and me a lot to chew on. A potential turning point for European defense. The whole push for sovereignty, figuring out how to pay for it all, that changing relationship with NATO. It's a huge moment in European history, and it matters far beyond Europe, too.
Absolutely. And as things develop, it's going to be really important to stay informed, to think critically, to consider all the different viewpoints out there. We've only just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this gives you a good, starting point for understanding this whole issue.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to our listener out there, as you keep following this story, just keep in mind that question we posed earlier. Can any nation, or even a powerful group like the EU, truly go it alone on defense these days? Or are we all just, interconnected? For better or for worse, something to think about as we watch this whole new chapter unfold in European defense. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time for another, hopefully just as fascinating, exploration of something you care about.